Okay, perfect. That should be working. And now I will go ahead and it over to Bob. Bob, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. And thank you for all the work you put into getting me connected to teams to do this, and for the invitation to talk to CELH, or I would like to pronounce acronyms, SEAL. So go ahead with the next slide.
Is it coming through?
No.
No.
No, we're stuck on the SEAL.
Oh, well, I have just changed it on my screen. That is a problem. Let me see if
While you're working on that, I'll just continue talking.
Okay, 1 second. I'll get this fixed.
The overall objective that I have here is to talk further about the perception I use of a continuing legal tradition that encases successive legal systems, so that one can incorporate both the strong emphasis on continuity in the legal structure in England, and also the drastic changes. And so by comparing the one facet of the law, which is not legal doctrine but litigation, how people carried out suits and perceived suits, I can emphasize the large difference between the way in which the law worked in around 1300 and the way it was working in 1642. 1642 is the Trinity term. 1642 is the term I'm calendaring on the vault for the last 2 or 3 years. And so, do we have the slides?
Is it showing?
It's not coming through for me.
Ooh. Okay. Let me try this one more time. It's showing up on my computer.
I'm sure glad we chose to have you run the slides instead of me.
Don't say that yet. Is this any better, or?
I've got it now.
Okay, perfect.
So Trinity of 1642, the CP40s, have 7 roles, and I'm through 4.7 roles at the moment. I'll finish this 5th role probably in about a month, and then about 4 months after that, I'll have all 7 roles of the Trinity term 1642 common pleas roles calendared. They're already available, as far as I've got on the vault, with the under the link that I have up there at the top, and that same link will lead you to the KB27s, the King's Bench roles for several terms, and the Chancery decrees, and the C33s, and the Chancery final decrees, the C78s, for right before the English Civil War began. I chose that because this, for me, from the way in which I perceive this continuing legal tradition with a succession of legal systems, 1642, the way I'm beginning to think of it now, is not at the end of the 3rd legal system, but really the beginning of the 4th. And so for me, it's kind of a milestone term. And for most people, this English Civil War is likewise an important benchmark. So in preparation for this, the database so far covers more than 4.5 roles. So I'm up to 2,100 membranes now. And so that provides me with an actual database of, I don't know, 20 or 30,000 enrollments. But for this talk, I just was trying to ascertain whether my impression was borne out by a quantification. And so I took 3 different sets, each of 511 enrollments. 511 because I started with the plaintiffs whose name began with B, and there happened to be 511 in that particular role. And so I just duplicated that number so I'd have equal databases. So I've got 3 databases of 511 enrollments, and that helps to control each other so that I have some sense about what kind of variance it is. So it's a database, a sub-database of 1,533 cases, which isn't actually that much compared to the whole, but it's working from the full set that's now available on the WALT. It's easy to expand that. It would take about a day and a half to add another 511, and it's relatively easy with the Control F search to find almost anything. Can you go to the next slide?
Is it coming through?
Yes.
Yes.
So when you look at this is about litigation, not about legal doctrine, and one can look at litigation from a number of different ways. I'm looking at litigation here from the standpoint of the parties and the sheriff and the sheriff's bailiffs, not from the standpoint of the clerks at Westminster or the justices. So it's basically as people experience the law. And so what I've done here is to emphasize one difference between 1300 and 1642, and thereby showing the huge difference in the way in which people face the law. The first, and this will be no news to anyone really, is that there are many fewer kinds of actions. Back in 1300, there were really an immense number of individualized kinds of writs. Most of them weren't used frequently, but you could always run across almost everyone if you went through a year's worth of plea rolls. By the time you get to 1642, almost everything is some form of debt or some form of trespass. And you can see, yeah, the set 1, set 2, set 3, each of those is 511 enrollments. And debt is about 2/3 of the cases. And trespass for breach of close is remarkably uniform in the 511 sets, the 511 enrollment sets at 24%. And so even right there, you're up over 80%. But then trespass and assault, trespass that comes from an assault, indebitatus assumpsit, ejectment. So those are the debt and trespass reactions. You can throw in defamation from down below, and miscellaneous case, and so you're up to about 98% of the cases of the enrollments are debt or some form of trespassory case. So I keep switching over to saying case because it's so reflexive, but these are not really case counts. They're enrollment counts. Can you go to the next slide? So all kinds of people count cases, and that's been going on for decades. And problem is in trying to get one's database, it's really tempting to look for a shortcut. And the shortcut that people have taken with counting cases is using the attorney rolls. and that's intrinsically flawed. If you look at the membrane that is on the screen, this is from the body of the plea roll, not the attorney warrants. And the odd thing about debt, which you'll remember now is about 2/3 of the cases, of the 2/3 of the enrollments. If you look at the enrollment for a case of debt, not unusually you will find that it's not one case, it's a series of cases in one enrollment. So if you look at the blue arrows, which I hope you can see, you'll see the versus that introduces the defendant, and you'll see 3 of those, with a 4th one being a new terque. So giving a sum that 2 individuals each have to pay. And so there are actually four defendants here, with 3 different sums owed, clearly different cases. And that was the case for debt all the way back to Edward I. I can, oddly enough, I can still remember seeing a note of in a set of reports that indicated that that was unusual because one original writ can initiate any number of cases, and that remained the case. And so if you count enrollments, this comes out as one enrollment, but it's actually 4 cases. And the hazard with using attorney warrants is that the attorney warrants don't go into this kind of detail. The attorney warrant for this enrollment would just list the plaintiff and the defendants, leading you to think incorrectly that this is one case of debt against 4 individuals, when it's actually 4 different cases. That means if you use the attorney warrants as your shortcut to get a database for the litigation, you're actually violating the first rule of quantification, which is know what you're counting. And I was taught that back a long time ago in graduate school, and my reaction when I heard that was, well, duh, as if anyone wouldn't know what they were counting. But that my reaction then has come back to haunt me every day, because the problem with most of the counting that's done is that it ignores, it skips over knowing what one is counting. And so to get to a reasonable count, and I'll just jump to the conclusion here, it's not clear to me that one can count the cases, simply because there are too many variables. And I'll come back to this. That this is a sub-theme of these slides. But this difficulty only applies to debt. In trespass and forms of trespass, you could actually work from the attorney warrants. And so one has to actually skip the attorney warrants for if you're going to do a real case count of any kind, and actually go to where you can see what's happening in the body of the plea roll. Next slide. Okay, so not only were there many fewer forms of writs by 1642, the administrative structure was completely different. From the 12th through the 15th centuries, sheriffs and their bailiffs were expected to go out and summon and distrain and attach and arrest people as part of the mean process. That's a consuming a time-consuming exercise, And it wasn't unusual for sheriffs and their bailiffs to come up short on time. So going through from initial summons or initial attachment to the exigent for outlawry was an indeterminate amount of time, simply because sheriffs had such great difficulty in finding people. Moreover, since the bailiffs were out attaching or distraining or whatever they were supposed to do, there had to be confrontations, and this is a form of process that emphasizes those confrontations, because the sheriffs and the bailiffs were so hands-on during the mean process. And so what you actually saw in the plea rolls ordering distraints or attachments or whatever was actually matched on the ground. In other words, you can read the plea rolls and you can be relatively confident that someone out there is actually trying to do something to the defendants to get them to come into court. In the 16th century, and this was true by around 1500, but actually complete by 1642 or 1607 even, sheriffs just ignored those initial orders. John Baker has noted already that by 1500, the initial order, the sheriffs could ignore the initial orders with impunity. But that's looking kind of at what you see in the plea roll. It's perfectly true. But what that kind of statement overlooks is that they're actually building something different. So except for Dower and Replevin, and Dower and Replevin, the mean process orders continued to be executed, and one can document that relatively easily. But except for Dower and Replevin, which, by the way, constitute, I think, less than 1% of the enrollments, as Baker has noted, the writs just made their way from one office at Westminster to another, and didn't actually go out to the sheriff. The sheriffs had to appoint an attorney to receive the writs, and that attorney just turned the writ over and wrote on it that couldn't be found or have nothing, and returned it back to the original office. And so those orders just stayed at Westminster. That meant that there was no confrontation on the ground whatsoever. There was actually, I see no way in which the defendant would actually have known that he was being sued until one gets to the exigent process. That presents a lot of good side. In other words, there's less possibility for confrontation and violence in the serving process. And it provided a cooling off period, but it was absolutely mechanical. In other words, it went from summons to a capias to a sicut prius capias, sicut plurius capias, and then exigent order. You could get in 2 pieces of process per term, and so at that, and then it would go into exigent, and I'll talk about exigent in just a second. And then into pleading. And so you could actually know within a month or two how long it was going to take until you actually headed out to face a jury. So and in 1300, you could guess a range of length of time to get to a jury, but it's pretty easy to find cases that get to the sicut plurius capias, and then sicut plurias and sicut plurias and sicut plurias, but because it wasn't being executed, because the personnel on the ground did not have time to do all the work. So this meant that the legal process was less confrontational on the mean process side, but also much more predictable. It is the case that that I've been able to find a few cases in which, outside of replevin and dower, that were executed, but that's very thin. That's a very thin body of materials. It's much less than 1%. Probably in a given role, I might find 10 or 15 enrollments that in which something was actually being done on the earlier process. So one got to the exigent order in about 2 terms. And the exigent order was distinctly different than it had been back around 1300. And this is jurisdictional. In 1300, you could not get outside the English counties. And so the margination on an enrollment indicated the sheriff that was going to be involved, and one couldn't have a Welsh county listed as the margination. That formally remained the same in 1642, but about somewhere in the 1450s, one began to find defendants who resided in Wales, and as a factual matter, Welsh residents were being hauled into the Court of Common Pleas at Westminster under a margination that was for London. That has serious problems, because if you're a Welsh resident and the outlawry process is taking place in London, you may not know that you're being outlawed. And so you could go all the way to outlawry without having any idea of that you were being sued. So obviously unfair. And that was taken care of by including the proclamation. And the proclamation was provided by statute in 1512, reinforced in 1514, and then expanded in 1589. In the 1512 and 1514 statutes, it was ordered that they didn't stop doing the false margination for London. What they did was provided a proclamation in the actual residence of the defendants. And so in 1512 and 1514, the provision was that proclamations could be sent anywhere, including Wales, and the place where the proclamation was made that notified people that they were being sued and put up for outlawry were made in the quarter sessions and in the county court. In 1589, it was the proclamations also extended to the parish in which the defendant was resident. And so that was the point at which you really did know that you were being sued. That was the first time that there was a necessary notification. This was just a proclamation, though. It wasn't like that. It wasn't that the bailiff or the sheriff had to locate the person and take goods from him or distrain or do anything else. It was merely a proclamation. So to stop the outlawry, to prevent being the outlawry process going to completion and resulting in the defendant being outlawed and unable to operate at common law. To stop that from happening, the sheriff didn't have to do anything, or his bailiffs. The defendant had to get in contact with the relevant sheriff and provide mainperners. So from the sheriff's point of view, this is dead easy. They just have to sit at their central office, or their chief clerk has to sit at their central office, and wait for the defendants to get in contact with them. So instead of the sheriff going out or his bailiffs going out and finding people, they have to go and find him. And this means that all of those early pieces of process are no longer being executed. And at the first point at which a person is actually going to know that they're being sued, I mean, it's completely possible, and I suspect often, that the plaintiff's attorney would contact the defendant and say, "We're suing you, pay up." But the first necessary time at which people would know that they're being sued is at the time of proclamation. And by the way, the actual county in which the proclamation is being made is the second margination. So you'll have a margination, say, for London or for Shropshire or wherever, and a proclamation being made in Brecon. Sure. So this allowed for sheriffs to handle a much larger number of cases, and allowed the jurisdiction of the Court of Common Pleas to extend fictitiously on the plea roll, but in reality, in fact, on the ground, extended the jurisdiction of the Court of Common Pleas to Wales. And that means, of course, that if you're counting from cases from the attorney rolls, you're actually counting the cases that are in fact from Brecon as a case from London, and so you cannot actually do a reasonable count if you don't include Wales. And if you exclude Wales, you're excluding 13 counties that after the proclamation took effect were effectively within the jurisdiction of the Court of Common Pleas. Okay, next. So the kind of forfeiture that one expected to have when mean process was executed around 1300 resulted in forfeitures that were really relatively mild, from 2 or 3 or 4 pence on up to 40 pence. And that, together with the expectation that you would comply, and that people would often comply anyway, but there was no huge incentive. If you're involved in a case for something that's, say, of 40 or 50 pounds, and you're going to suffer a 2 pence or 4 pence penalty for not showing up in court, you might actually reasonably choose to just ignore the summons or the attachment or whatever. That changed dramatically once you got to eliminating the reality of the earlier pieces of mean process, because at exigent, when you search down the sheriff to stop the exigent process by giving main prize that you would show up in court on the right day, the main prize in the Court of Common Pleas was usually 40 pounds. And there's a cascading effect, because the defendant would have to give main prize for the 40 pounds, and he would also have to find 2 main perners who would similarly commit to 40 pounds. So there were 3 performance bonds for 40 pounds. Each, normally for the defendant to show up, and the people who were the main perners were usually not all that confident that the defendant would actually comply. And so I have a number of cases showing that main earners would then get their own performance bond from the defendant, so that they would be able to collect from him if they had to pay. And so the defendant was faced not only with his 40-pound bond for appearing, but with a corresponding debt that was owed to the two main earners. And those, even in the late 15th century, were often double the amount owed. And so what you had riding on his appearance would be the 80 pounds that the main earners would get from the defendant if he didn't show up, and the 40 pounds that the debtor himself owed. And so it was actually 120 pounds that was riding on his actual appearance. And so that's hugely different from 2 pence or 40 pence or whatnot. So this was a much more coercive regime in terms of getting people to appear. And with that much money riding on his appearance, many fewer people actually defaulted. King's Bench was quite different, of course, because of the Bill of Middlesex. With the Bill of Middlesex, the opening real piece of process is the arrest and finding the main prize. So if you wanted a really fast procedure, you would go to King's Bench, because first real step there was people showing up on your doorstep and arresting you. Whereas in common pleas, there was about a 6-month cooling off period in which you could actually pay and stop everything. But then you were back in the same pot with a really ferocious kind of performance bond for appearing. And so this provided a much more predictable part of the process. So you had no execution of the first stages of mean process in common pleas, and a really very strong execution of process at the exigent level. But for none of this did the sheriff actually have to go out and do anything, or his bailiffs. If anything, if the defendant was going to do anything, which he would certainly want to do, given the level of penalties, the defendant had to find them. And so from the party's perspective, this is worlds different. Even though all the words were the same, except for the proclamation, even though all the words for the exigent writ and so forth were the same, it worked very differently. The performance bonds for appearance that I've seen for common pleas are standardly 40 pounds. King's Bench is more varied. You get 10, 20, 100, and 200 pound performance bonds there. But the severity of the process and predictability of the process is basically the same. But note that because of the proliferation of the performance bonds for appearance, this process is a litigation multiplier. In other words, if a debtor stopped the exigent process by the provision of main prize, and he defaulted, then the sheriff would go against would litigate against the defendant and against both main earners, and the main earners would each sue the defendant. So you could have another 5 cases arising from that one piece of exigent process. And so those are essentially auxiliary, or I don't know, auxiliary suits that flowed from that one dispute. And they are legitimately debts, and you can easily count those as different cases. But depending on what you're looking for if you're counting cases, they might flow from just one dispute. And that's part of the reason I think why one gets so many suits. That the process itself generated litigation. And when you're dealing with a reasonable percentage of the cases being cases that were penalties for non-appearance, you have to wonder about the value that's being provided by the law. A debt one ordinarily thinks about as being somehow related to a productive activity, like leasing land to add to your productivity when you still have people at home growing up that can work, and you can handle more land for a while, or buying things, or borrowing money to build a new process for making something new. Those are particularly valuable things because they are innovative enterprises that can move society forward. Or allowing people to kind of hold on a little bit longer when they're in hard times. Ensuring the effectiveness of the legal process has some real economic value. I think that value, at some point, the amount of that, the amount of value that's actually provided by that rigorous process is not really conducive to furthering economic activity. One can argue this. I don't know how to put a monetary value on making sure that the process is effective, but it seems relatively obvious to me. It may not to you, but it seems relatively obvious to me that the level of defaults for non-appearance, while it would certainly provide smooth process, are probably a detriment to overall economic activity. You can imagine if since main price had to be a kind of standard activity for anyone with money, if you were one of the main firms, if you had several of these collapse at the same time, you could be out 200 or 300 pounds easily, and that might kind of push you over into bankruptcy or selling land, or your lifestyle would be impacted kind of dramatically. How much is a good value for forfeiture? I don't know. So one can argue about kind of that, but you have to recognize that part of the economic activity that you see in the debt cases is not productive, it's productive in a very different way than one would ordinarily expect for cases of debt. Next slide. Or have I put you to sleep? Okay. So, after pleading, jury process was, for someone who's familiar with the rules in 1300, jury process is just eerily predictable. From 1300, one is used to multiple issues of venari facias to summon the jury. And it could go on for a long time. And even when a jury assembled, it could be that not all of them were there. And so one had to start over again. That stopped in 27 Henry VIII and through at least to 1642, and I have no reason to think it stopped then. When a full panel did not appear, or if no one appeared, the plaintiff could and would petition the court to select additional jurors from the people around, de circumstantibus, so that the first time you actually tried to get a jury, you would get a jury. And so instead of waiting and going through multiple venire faciases, stretching out over 6 months, a year, 2 years, or more, you got a jury successfully on the first try. So that just there is a kind of a compounding set of problems with this. That is, if the plaintiff had laid the action in the properly wrong county, so if they had specified London, which they would do to move the process along faster, because the exigent process in London is the court meets every 2 weeks, and so you can move through the exigent process more than twice as fast if you say that the event happened in London, or also in York or Norfolk or Exeter. So a number of different counties had this kind of margination proliferation. If that happened, the jury would come from there too, even if the defendant was resident in Wales and, say, had never been in London. The jury would still be outside your place of residence. That means that any hope that the jury would be self-informing was just completely gone. No one on the jury might be from your own area, and so the expectation that one would have had in 1300 that the jury would come from your locality evaporated. Okay, next slide. But that meant that jury process was just really predictable too. So the overall effect of all of this was almost like a machine on the process side. You fed the case in at the beginning, and it went smoothly and predictably through to the end. Okay, further complication in kind of evaluating what's happening, and a huge difference from back in 1300. So a significant number of debt cases, and so in the subsets of 511 enrollments, 38%, 11%, and 19%, or overall 25% of enrollments were undefended. When I don't know, what, a decade and a half ago, when I was working on Trinity Term 1607, I came across my first undefended debt case, which states that the attorney for the defendant hadn't been instructed by his client what to say, and so the case went against him as undefended. The first one I read, I thought, I have never seen an attorney that negligent, that he didn't get his instruction from his client about what to say. And then I ran across another, and then another dozen, and then a couple hundred. And it's just astounding how many undefended debt cases there are, and they're all done in one term. In other words, there's no prior process. It's a setup, and with 25, that's 25% of the debt enrollments were immediately undefended. And so the client just surrendered, as it were. That you just don't find that kind of thing back in 1300. And so I concluded, and still conclude, that this has to be some kind of collusive activity. And the damages for the immediate judgment are usually fairly small. So my conclusion was, and still is, that these are collusive cases. And when I've talked about this before, I had thought that the enrollment was the original debt instrument. In other words, if I wanted to borrow from you £100, what I would do is I would go with you into court, and you would immediately set forth the paper process for debt litigation, and I would just confess owing the debt, and that would mean that if I defaulted, you could use a scire facias and just collect the debt, so that it would kind of enshrine the debt in the legal process. It would mean that at the very beginning you had already reached judgment, which would kind of invoke the common law's objection to chancery intervention after judgment given in debt. So it would be a very effective mechanism for giving credit without having too much process obstructing you from getting legal help in collecting. But I think that hypothesis is wrong. I don't anymore think that it's the original debt instrument masquerading as a case of debt in which the defendant just surrenders. But it has to be some kind of collusive instrument. And my current hypothesis, one of the difficulties with the way in which I was thinking then, was all the debts, all the dates that one had in a case of debt. You know, when the bond was made, and you know, what kind of when the due date was, and they would have to have made up all the backdated dates. And I think what's actually happening is due date extension. In other words, if I have already borrowed from you £100 and I've missed my due date, and you are inclined to extend the due date, but you want to make sure that you're actually going to be able to get paid, this is a way for the defendant to extend the due date, and a way for the creditor to make sure that if the due date passes, you're actually going to be able to get your money back expeditiously. You can do this collusive debt action and be assured that you're going to be able to collect rapidly. That in a way is a really good thing, because it encourages creditors who are inclined to extend the due date to go ahead and do so. The question is, for historians, is that a case? Because both sides are getting something out of it. The debtor gets the due date extension, and the creditor gets immediate access to the scire facias after the extension. And it's not the usual. One doesn't think of a case being collusive like that. And one can go, again, it depends on what you're looking for if you're counting. But if you're counting on some kind of adversarial situation between plaintiff and defendant for it to count as a case, these aren't cases. If you're looking at just formalistically, are these people using the court, and you're willing to call that a case, I guess I wouldn't. But if you're willing to call that a case, then you go ahead and throw that in with everything else. But But 25% of the enrollments in debt are this kind of collusion. And so there are all kinds of difficulties in what you're going to call a case and how you're going to see through the form down into the kind of social reality that you want to do when you're actually doing some kind of quantification. But I think, of course, I think this all the time when I'm thinking something wrong. I think this is the correct explanation. It has to be some kind of collusiveness. And this explanation avoids people backdating and kind of figuring out dates in the past where something could have happened, and just getting it through as a initial debt foundation. I think it's rather a due date extension. But these are clearly collusive and non-adversarial, which throws a huge wrench into any kind of quantification effort that doesn't actually handle explicitly how they're going to count cases and why they're going to count them that way. And it means that you can't tell any of this from the attorney roles. You have to go ahead and do the body of the plea roles to get to this kind of analysis. And it is probably the case that one should have the most skilled person on the project doing the initial counting rather than the least skilled person doing the boring work. Okay, next set of slides. Okay, so you have a mass of undefended debt cases, but you also find a reasonable number of undefended trespass and case cases. These obviously aren't going to be due date extensions. You just don't have due dates in most of this stuff. So only about 5% of trespass and indebitatus cases, indebitatus assumption cases went undefended. But a third, when you look at when you separate it out and look at the indebitatus assumption cases, a third of them were undefended. So in indebitatus assumption, you have a reasonable percentage of cases in which the defendant simply admits the case. The oddity here is that in trespass and in any trespass reaction, if the defendant just admits, judgment will go against the defendant, but the court will automatically then order an inquest to see what the damages were, because they say that they cannot know what the damages are just from the plaintiff's count. So that I've called that inquest the Inquest of Damages, and it's automatic. It takes place without seemingly any additional formality that's apparent in the plea rolls, and there's a very nice side to that in trespass, say for assault, because in assault, if the defendant says, "Well, yes, I did it," and the only thing left is kind of how much I owe, and you and I disagree on that, but I've already admitted the base liability, and that has to have diffused some of the discord between the plaintiff and the defendant, because the defendant has already admitted that he did a wrong thing against you. And it's much more reasonable to think that we just disagree on how much I have to pay. So that's more honorable in a way. You've already admitted that you've done something wrong. And so this is it's hard to say cordial, because I doubt that the situation was often what we would call cordial. But it's more cordial. It's less antagonistic, less adversarial, less less discord within the community because of this dispute. In indebitadas assumpsit, where about a third of the cases are undefended, it's much more interesting actually, because one finds in the pleadings cases that I sold you malt or wheat or whatever, for as much as they were as it was reasonably worth, or as reasonably merited. I can't actually say whether those such things are apparent in debt cases around 1300, because I haven't gone back and looked. But my recollection of the cases around 1300 don't include sales for prices like as much as they were reasonably worth or as reasonably merited. And yet, if you think about it, for many transactions at the local level, that's the most likely way in which people were going to sell. If I had a field of wheat growing, and I was going to deliver it to you for X amount of money, it'd be hard to predict how much that wheat would actually be worth, because you don't know the value of, you know, how healthy the crop is, or how good a crop it's going to be. And so, as much as they were reasonably worth or as reasonably merited, makes a lot of sense for a local transaction. But you have no way of knowing what it's going to be, and you might well come to the day when delivery is expected, and really disagree about how much the wheat's worth. And this is a way of providing for that kind of thing. But it's also a very different kind of thing. You might agree on an explicit sum, 60 shillings for my wheat. And when I deliver it to you, you look at it and say, that's not really worth 60 shillings. It's really worth more like 40. Just admitting that you're liable in indebitadas assumpsit gives you a way to review an explicit purchase price when goods turned out to be not as valuable as they were purported to be at that time. So it'd be the inquest of damages in that situation provides for a way of reducing the agreed upon clear price for the wheat to a fair price, simply by admitting liability and having the court assess the amount of the liability through the inquest of damages. I think that's kind of interesting, and it also provides a good linkage to one of the big strands of legal historical research on the American side, in which, coming into the late 18th century, the common law was reputedly interested in making sure that there was a fair price, instead of a caveat emptor approach that would focus on the amount that had been agreed upon. So next slide. So overall, you have many fewer forms of action. You have paperwork, including paper pleadings. It's hard to make out the paper pleadings, or particularly the post-trial motions in 1642 from the CP40s. You don't see, what you see is just adjournments. You don't see the post-trial motions anymore. But paperwork, instead of hands-on mean process, reducing confrontational side of mean pleading. Very predictable mean process, pleading in less than a year with a predictable time for getting a jury verdict. Caution about, which has been a sub-theme here, the difficulties of counting cases from enrollments, to the extent that it may not really be plausible to count cases, or at least it would be very, very labor intensive. The extension of the common law at Westminster to Wales and liberties like Cheshire and Durham, Lancashire, by use of the proclamation. The proclamation is a really important development of the law here. Removal of the jury from the location in which the event occurred by laying a false margination. That goes back to the middle of the 15th century, but it just expands and has proliferated by 1642. The undefended debt cases to establish but not enforce debt. So providing for an extension of the due date in a large number of cases. And that ability has an economic effect of encouraging and facilitating credit arrangements. And the availability of credit is an essential part of the case. Forgot to mention here that the downside of these undefended debt cases is that it seems that it's possible that this allowed people with money to form dependent relationships with debtors, because occasionally there'll be a subsequent, almost like a postea, there'll be a subsequent appearance by the creditor that he's been satisfied of the debt, and these satisfactions can, these admissions that they've been paid can come often 10, 15, 18 years. I don't think I've reached 20, but in 1642 I found creditors admitting that they've been paid in 1658 when this was done in 1642, which would seem to indicate that the debt was just being held over them. And of course, if you have the ability to call in the debt at any given time, then the debtor is much more likely to be interested in supporting you in all kinds of different ways, just to make sure that you don't call in the debt. And so this is kind of a debt servitude arrangement, which for many people they would be able to pay off rapidly, but in some situations this would allow wealthy people to have dependence, kind of patronage power over the debtors. And undefended trespass cases to focus just on the amount of damages instead of base liability, and undefended indebitatus assumpta cases to handle vague purchase amounts or unfair deals. So this is a kind of litigation setup that you don't find in 1300. And there's all kinds of continuity, and I handle that by talking about a continuing legal tradition, because except with the proclamation, almost all the words are the same. I mean, you use the same writs or developments from something that look like the same writs. The mean process sounds like it's the same, but it's completely different. And so you have to figure out a way to express both the continuity of the law as well as the change, because they're both really important. And the way I do that is by talking about a continuing legal tradition that encases a succession of legal systems. And that's, by the way, how the AALT is set up on the main index page. And so that ties into the AALT. And so I'm done with this portion of it, and we can go on to questions. Are you still awake, Doug?
So much, Bob. Oh, yeah, still there. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. Pages of notes, and I'll go ahead and open it up for any questions. Please raise your hand or just, turn your microphone and go ahead. Ian.
Thank you very, very much for that. That was fascinating. On the extension to Wales and the proclamation point, there's a document in the Huntingdon from the late 1630s, early 1640s. It's dated as received 1641, but I think it's probably about 1638, 39, where there are complaints about the justice system in Wales. They complain about quo minus being used to take cases out of Wales into neighbouring English counties. And the other complaint they make is directly about this point about outlawry. Sorry, I'm just about to cough. And what they actually say is they say, in like manner, the attorneys, will lay any action that is not local in London or any other county of England and proceed to outlaw any man in Wales, both in the King's Bench and Common Pleas, though the party never have notice. And then they say this is then immediately transcribed into the Exchequer, or is then transcribed into the Exchequer, still with the Welsh party not knowing about the case. And then the outlawry is enforced against them. So that goods are searched for, value of their income from the lands is taken. That's then seized by the court, and then that's paid to the plaintiff for satisfaction of the debt. So they're saying that in Wales, at least for certain defendants, even the proclamation system doesn't work. You're still getting a judicial process or legal process which is hidden for the defendants.
Yes, and this is not a new complaint. One suspects it was complained of vigorously all the way back to the time that began in the 1450s. And the proclamation isn't personal. In other words, no one is ever obliged to make sure that you know. All they do is they proclaim it after 1589 that the proclamation is that you're being sued is read out in county court, quarter session, and after 1589 in your parish. That doesn't mean that you've actually heard it, and there's no necessity for you actually knowing. There is reasonable opportunity for you to know, because it's in the closest one is proclamation in your parish. But the amount of effort that the sheriff's personnel have to go through with this is okay. I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly how this went. But I suspect they just read a list of names. That John Doe is being sued. John Doe is being sued, say, by Richard Roe in debt. This is in London or wherever it is. But it must have just been a long list of people, and you could easily just be snoring at the back of the church, and you would never know that it actually happened. And so there's no assurance of actual knowledge, and so they have every reason to complain. Now, if the proclamation is made in the wrong place, that's error, and they can reverse that. But this is an actual. You're not going to get a perfect system, but this is a real imperfection, because when I was working on 1607, Trinity's term of 1607, I, in addition to working on the Court of Common Pleas, I did King's Bench, and in an excess of devotion, I went to Aberystwyth and looked through the Welsh rolls there, and I counted them up, and the cases out of Wales that I saw in 1607 in the Court of Common Pleas outnumbered the cases that were in the Welsh county courts. Not by a whole lot, but kind of roughly half the Welsh cases were mismarginalized, and so you can't diminish that problem. They had a real complaint. It should be noted that you get the same kind of situation in English counties, because that's going to happen by the nature of this process. But you can go through and list all the benefits and burdens, and there are real burdens to this one. Benefit is how are you going to handle that flood of litigation in Elizabeth's reign? And this allowed them to do that. And even that is perhaps too rosy an impression, because there are all kinds of things that I've said on the way through that indicate real benefits to the way in which the law changed. It's also the case that the courts were probably the most effective mechanisms of governance, and in even early modern England. And Donahue had I don't know, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, made a comment that allowing one person to sue another is the weakest form of governmental action. But if you don't have any of the stronger mechanisms that we have today, then you go with that. But what you see is a better law, a law that functions more smoothly, more predictably, and mean process mechanically, avoids confrontations between officials and parties. There are all kinds of good things there, but that makes it a more effective law, and that makes it the velvet glove that covers the steel fist. And in 1642 is a bit past that, because one of the things leading into the fourth legal system is the abandonment of large-scale use of quitom actions. That happens around 1621. So a lot of the stuff that, like penalties imposed on people, the people bringing private suits to enforce penalties on statutory prohibitions, like the 1529 clerical statutes, or things like fouling springs or whatnot. Almost all of that was given up by 1642, and it happened around 1621. And so a lot of the heavy use of private enforcement of of statutory law by vicious penalties was gone, and as far as I know, didn't resurface until Texas passed its awful abortion law. But that uses the exact quitom kind of mechanisms that were proliferating from Henry VIII on through most of James. But you can't kind of do any of this without recognizing that the law is it's a primary governance unit, and the better the law becomes, the more serviceable it is, the more effective it is at imposing royal will. And so there are ups and downs on all of this, and what you point out there with the proclamation, that's you cannot downplay that. and you can't just restrict it to Wales. And it's also just thinking about the increase in litigation. You're including in common law jurisdiction 13 extra counties, and Cheshire and Durham and Lancashire. And that's going to play some part in the additional litigation. In other words, it's just including, it's not a demographic matter of the size of the population growing. It's a geographical thing. And the from what I saw in the Welsh rolls, the number of cases brought in is the nearer Welsh counties are as prolific in producing Westminster cases as most of the rest of the counties of England. It's the ones that are farther away that are a bit light, but you can't diminish the kind of impact of that kind of litigation. So the statute for the resumption of liberties in Henry VIII, it would take a while for attorneys to get used to taking cases into Westminster from some of these heavy liberties, and so part of the increase in litigation is just going to be because the common law has extended its reach into all kinds of liberties and into Wales. I went rather beyond your question there, but I tend to be verbose anyway.
Do we have any additional questions before we move on, or anyone wants to stick around to a discussion of the AALT project? Okay, well, I have one, but I'll hold on to it. So in the interest of getting to discuss, I'll ask you separately, Bob, to discuss the AALT. Would you mind providing us with a bit of an update on the project and how it's coming along?
Both ups and downs. On the upside, we now have about 375 years of consecutive common pleas and King's Bench plea rolls. There's a year lacking in James for the Court of Common Pleas, and there's half a year lacking at the very end of James's reign for the Court of King's Bench. But otherwise, it's 375 years of consecutive plea rolls. So progress has slowed kind of dramatically, but we're still making reasonable progress. And within, I don't know, maybe a year and a half, it'll be up to about 400 consecutive years. And we have outposts further on during the Commonwealth from 1642 to about 1645, and some during the American Revolution, and spotty coverage elsewhere for comparative purposes. But we are continuing. We are changing over servers to a new server. You may note some interruptions in service, which should not be more than a few hours. I was notified that we had to get a new server back in February. We had a bout of really cold weather that took out the whole electrical grid in Texas, and that damaged the server that we are still currently using. And I was told that it was a matter of urgency to get a new server, and we may be making that transition now after about eight or 9 months, which is how we apparently talk about a matter of urgency. But not. By the way, I made the decisions and released the money within a week of being told that. But we are getting a new server, and eventually we'll switch over to a virtual server. But at this point, a new server, along with all the payments for people's time and whatnot, that's going to cost $17,000. and going to a virtual server, in other words, just renting space online for it, would be $17,000 a year. So the prudent thing to do at this point is just to get a new server. The downside of this is that TNA apparently is no longer willing to extend the license to new series. I had 2 requests in for getting permission to extend the license to include some series that individuals had already taken for their own personal uses, and that they offered to the AALT to post for free. I asked that of TNA, and after pausing, got a very ambivalent answer that said there were difficulties in it because TNA did not control the AALT, and that was a problem. It wasn't a problem when I started. When I started, the thing that they were worried about was them having to spend any staff time supervising or checking what was on the AALT. That has apparently reversed about 180 degrees. And despite, I don't know, 6, 8 requests, I'm still getting ambivalent responses. And so my read of the situation is that the current manager of licenses is just really uncomfortable with the AALT. And so I'm not expecting any further increases in series. Not that I have people on cameras who are, raring to go to do new series, but the relationship with TNA is somewhat odd, even though it's kind of been obviously useful during the pandemic because people can continue their research. But the relationship has always divided TNA, and that I've had lots of really strong proponents there, but also people who have been dubious from the very beginning because the main reason that I've been told was that we don't index all of it before we make it available. You can think about the difficulty of making 375 years of common pleas and King's Bench rules indexed before you make them available, and that to me seems unreasonable. We're trying to index as fast as we can, but there aren't hundreds of indexers out there. And by the way, for those of you who find you don't have enough to do, one can certainly make indexes of pipe rolls or of any date, or of plea rolls or anything else. It costs nothing, and I take no credit for it. Those indexes that I don't do but other people do are attributed solely to them. So if you are of a mindset to devote part of your free time to producing indices to make the documents more available to people, I encourage it. So there's no cost, total attribution to the people who do the work. And instead of waiting for serial publications to finally reach your year, you can just do your year and have that indexed and online. And I help people set up the format. I give as much advice to people as they want for kind of what categories of things should be labeled, but that's just advice. So I just make it possible for people to make the documents more accessible. And so if you find that you are overburdened with free time, I have a remedy for you.
Well, thank
I
you so
think
much.
those are the main things. I mean, the progress is relatively slow but continuing. Our financial situation is pretty good. The big problem is probably me, because although I don't expect it to happen, I could die at any time, and there is only one person. I'm waiting for a senior academic who knows Latin, who is kind of interested in helping the whole stretch of English legal historical work, and who is interested in the project to step forward to be a plausible successor. To be a plausible successor, you have to be somewhat younger than I am, but you need to be a senior academic, and you have to be able to handle the Latin documents. But while I make it a lot of work, because the only thing I do besides taking care of my wife is work on the vault, or upload documents for the AALT. And so for me, it's a lot of work, but for my successor, that doesn't have to be the case. You have to have someone who's interested, keeps hands on the project, and is willing to take some kind of administrative role, and eventually, hopefully, we'll have a stipend attached to it. But that is the thing that worries me most about the project, because while it was really advantageous to be to not have a committee that actually had to negotiate who's going to take, what reign are we going to handle first, which reign is most important. I didn't have to worry about that. I just kind of spread it out and did it the way I thought best, and so the whole thing is kind of tightly focused around my idea, and that was really I was able to get a lot of stuff done because I didn't have any impediment. But it has the huge downside of the possibility of death, and so if anyone is kind of interested in stepping in, I'm not interested in stepping out yet, but I am certainly interested in someone who is interested in perhaps taking over should something happen. By the way, I have no indication that something is going to happen. I am currently in good health.
I certainly hope that nothing does happen. I mean, we're all very much in your debt for the project and for the opportunities it's provided us. I'll go ahead and open it up to questions for anyone who has any, but I'll start off myself. Just out of personal curiosity, when you originally formulated this project, what was your kind of end goal that you had in mind? What if you could accomplish everything you wanted to with the project, what would that encompass?
In terms of subject matter, I was most interested in the plea rolls, the C-33s for Chancery, the remembrancer rolls in Exchequer. And I wanted to get those. The original license had 14 different series, and of those 14 different series, I haven't completed the Cheshire rolls or the rolls of the Duchy. The way things are going, it doesn't look like I'm going to. But I had the original specification was 1272 to 1650, and we've got that pretty well covered. So that was the original expectation, and the expectation was free access. So we don't even, there's not even a signing in for the AALT. Free access, availability of the major legal materials for medieval, early modern. We've obviously expanded earlier and later because there's a lot of 19th century materials there now. I had hoped that we launched in 2007, January. And in 2009, I believe, I started the Vault. That was not originally a part of it. And with the Vault, I had hoped that many more people would join in and start producing indices and whatnot. And that really hasn't happened. I've got Helen Good, who is working on Elizabethan Star Chamber, and two volunteers who are family historians, and Tom Smith, who is an historian. But it really hasn't taken hold in other people kind of using the site for their projects. I had thought that people would provide their databases, kind of work up their databases in a form that could then be posted on the Vault to reinforce their paper publications. Because you have to do a certain amount of, you have to do about half an index to actually work through a document anyway. And so it'd just be a bit more to make it so that the material became much more useful and much more available for people. And basically that hasn't happened, and that's something of a disappointment. But we have an immense amount of indexed material already. But I would hope that would grow eventually.
Do we have any additional questions or comments before we wrap up for the night? Well, in that case, thank you so very much, Bob. That was absolutely fantastic, very informative, and I hope a suitable successor does step forward, but hopefully it's not necessary anytime soon. This has been great, and for anyone who would like to join us in 2 weeks, we have Professor Liz Kamali speaking on her book, Felony in the Guilty Mind in Medieval England, at the same time 2 weeks from today. So thank you so very much. And yes?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
If you would find it helpful to have access to the slides, I can send you the set of slides or answer further questions or whatnot. Just let me know at rpalmer@uh.edu. I've got no problem with that whatsoever. So if you would find that helpful, all you have to do is ask.
Perfect.
Okay.
And the talk will be on our YouTube channel as well for anyone who would like to make reference to it. So thank you so very much again for an absolutely wonderful seminar, and we will see everybody soon.
Okay. Thank you.